you all have heard about that. But my work there, which I worked there for about a decade, was focused on the Colorado River Delta in Mexico and fostering partnerships across different agencies, federal, state, local communities to restore the Delta and work with collaborative water management between the US and Mexico and ecological restoration. So that was a very fun project. And that's kind of, I got introduced to a lot of Western water issues through that work. And I got a master's at the University of Colorado Boulder in environmental studies, where I did my research on the Delta. And yeah, I'm very, very excited to be joining the Colorado Water Center and working with this great team of folks, and excited to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, and I had forgotten, because I think it was you, Claire, who had asked me about the Sonoran Institute. You'd have been approached by the Sonoran Institute at our last meeting at Northern Water. And it was kind of funny because I'd forgotten, Karen, that you had worked for the Sonoran Institute. And so, Claire, if you have any other questions about the Sonoran Institute, please just contact Karen.
Also, Claire, Northern Water has been putting on classes with Sonoran Institute in the area. So Esther Vincent would be a good person for you to connect with also.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, good. Okay. Let's see. Typically, Jennifer, do we have a discussion of the previous session, or do we just cut into the book reports?
Well, you know, one of the things is I looked over the comments that you all made, and a couple of you asked for Brad Wynn's email, and I put that in the chat section. And a couple of you also asked about signing up for tours for Northern Water. They have an East Slope tour and a West Slope tour, and then they also do tours like we took of the construction. Which, John, we got to get you and Karen up there, so it's something quite to see. But in any case, they don't have like a sign up for over the winter for those tours. But start looking at Northern Water website in April and May, and they start setting those tours up if you want tours of their East or West Slope facilities. And that's all I can remember. Questions, unless anyone else has got some comments or questions.
Okay. Well, good. So then I tell you what, we're going to go straight into the book reports. So I'm looking across the screen. Oh boy. Okay. I tell you what, since he was the first one on, I'm going to go with Scott to start off the book reports. If that's just he was on, I think, before anybody. So Scott, why don't you take it away for your book report and give us a summary of the book you read and your impressions and your thoughts on it.
And you should be able to screen share if you'd like.
Yeah, I think I can go ahead and do that. Well, when I click share, I'm not seeing my presentation.
Huh.
Ben, do you have my slides that I emailed you that you could pull those up? I'm not.
Yeah. No, I can definitely do that. Just give me 1 second.
But my book was Beyond the 100th Meridian by Wallace Stegner. And I'm a fan of Wallace Stegner anyway. I've read a lot of his other books, which are all fiction, but really good books like Crossing to Safety and Angle of Repose and things of that nature. I think this is the only work of nonfiction that he did. I'm not familiar with a lot of nonfiction books that he's done. And one of the other reasons is my wife and I were born and raised in Iowa, and we've spent our adult lives in Colorado, so we make the drive back to Iowa to see family a couple of times a year. And for those of you that are familiar with the drive across Nebraska, you know that when you get between North Platte and Kearney, that's where you start to feel the stickiness of the humidity, and that is kind of where the title of this book comes from. So Benton, if you just put up the next slide. So yeah, the 100th meridian, like I said, is between the North Platte and Kearney, and essentially in Nebraska. And so that's where you start to feel the change in humidity. And one of the concepts is that, I'll get to the map of the arid lands here in a little bit. But the book essentially starts out, the first third is describing Powell's growing up in the Midwest. He's kind of a naturalist that is self-taught with his explorations of the upper Midwest, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, the Mississippi River. And he gained a frontier education essentially in the 1850s. And by the age of 27 in 1861, he was named secretary of the Illinois State Natural History Society. But then a month later, he was in the Civil War, and that's where he lost his right forearm in the Battle of Shiloh. So following the war, then Powell begins lecturing and on natural sciences and serves as a professor of geology at Illinois Wesleyan University before securing some funding that allows him to begin making bigger explorations out west. And the descriptions of the Rocky Mountains Scientific Exploring Expedition, which it's true adventure along the lines of if you like books like Endurance and the description of Shackleton's voyage or mountaineering, real true history. This is a great description of the first expedition to follow the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. And so in May of 1869, they leave Green River and start their expedition down the Green River, the Yampa, and then obviously into the Colorado. And by the time they're through the Green River, they feel as though they've experienced the worst of the rapids that they're going to see. And obviously that's not the case. They left at noon on May 24th, 1869, and they didn't get off the river, they didn't reach their destination until the end of August of that year. It was actually July 21st when they pushed off into the actual Colorado River. And after months on the river, and even with Powell being extremely cautious and lining around the worst of the rapids, they had lost a couple of their boats. One of their team members decided to climb out and leave the expedition, and their supplies were dwindling. They were subsisting on moldy flour and boiled bacon that had spoiled. And they made it to within just a couple they were at the very end of the voyage when three of the members of the team decided they'd rather not chance the last rapids, and they climbed out of the canyon and left the expedition and took their chances on the plateau to try and get north to the Mormon settlements. And so Powell pushed on with the six remaining, or as a group of six, and it was only a couple of days later that on August 30th, they passed through the Grand Wash Cliffs and ran into some Mormon settlers and reached their destination, or the end of their voyage. And they then went north to catch the train out of Utah back to Illinois. And that's when they found out that their three companions that had left them had made it to the top of the canyon wall and didn't make it much further. Got into a misunderstanding with the Indians in the area, and they didn't make it back. So that's the first third of the book. It's a really great true adventure story if you're interested in those. But then Powell returns to Illinois, essentially a national hero that has explored the Grand Canyon and the Colorado River. This was the time of manifest destiny when people were still saying that maybe the Colorado River could be a navigable route to the West Coast and the Pacific Ocean. And his exploration was showing some of those thoughts that came out of manifest destiny that just weren't true. But a lot of people, or a lot of politicians, didn't. Oh, thanks for changing the slide. Yeah, a lot of the politicians didn't want to hear what Powell had to say when he got back. Obviously, the Garden of Eden that everybody expected the West to be, his expedition was proving not quite to be true. So that's when Powell begins his career in government service. He starts with the Bureau of Ethnology and then later with the USGS. And the last half of the book, you could spend the whole class talking about political maneuvering and competition between the surveys and all of the challenges that Powell faced. But the main takeaway that I had for the purposes of this class was obviously his thoughts on, rather than dividing up the West like the East had been divided up, the federal government, and I'll just quote from the book here, the federal government's principal aim in establishing a plan of rectangular surveys of the public lands into ranges, townships, and sections was to essentially distribute the land to the settlers and the railroads and the colleges and other improvements of the West. However, what worked well to the eastward worked increasingly badly beyond the 100th meridian, because the lands of beyond the 100th meridian received less than 20 inches of annual rainfall, and 20 inches was the minimum for unaided agriculture. That one simple fact was to be, and is still to be, more fecund of social and economic and institutional change in the West than all of the acts of the presidents and Congresses from the Louisiana Purchase to present. So Powell was of the mind that the land should be divided up by watersheds rather than these arbitrary rectangle shapes that work well in the East, but not out in the West, where the rainfall wouldn't support the farming and wouldn't support wouldn't support a smaller parcel of land like it would in the East. So with that, I don't know how much time I have. Like I said, you could spend the rest of the meeting talking about the positioning and the maneuvering in Congress and trying to get funding for the different expeditions. But my main takeaway was really the Powell's theory or Powell's position that the West should have been divided up by watersheds. And had the politicians listened to the science at that time, we probably wouldn't have all the legal battles and a lot of the issues that we have today. So I'll leave it at that. If there are any questions or anybody, it's a really great book. It's a lot of great history.
So Scott, one question I have is I'm pretty sure I read this book like 30 years ago. I mean, a while ago.
Right.
And one thing I remember is, and I'm trying to remember if it's this book or the book Men to Match by Mountains by Stegner. But one of them, when it was talking about Powell going down, there there were competitions for discovering the course of the Colorado River. And I remember, at least in those parts, and in essence, if you think about it, it was like the competing scientists sending press releases back to Washington. It just sort of struck me as to how in research and science we have not advanced beyond that.
Right.
But if you could touch a little on the competing expedition and basically how they approached, I guess, the level of scientific integrity they had in discovering the course of the Colorado River versus Powell.
Yeah, well, there's an ongoing discussion about the King and Hayden surveys, and they're constantly sending reports back. Well, not constantly. When they have the opportunity, reports are being sent back to the Chicago Tribune and other papers in the Midwest, and there are all kinds of misinformation, reports of either survey or either party being lost prematurely, and then a couple of weeks later, the news comes out that, and I can't remember from Utah, they send dispatches back and letters that refute what was written in the paper the week before, and it was really a competition. And I think Powell's was the most scientific of all of them. It was just that wasn't the results that he was sending back weren't as popular with the politicians that wanted to hear that this was going to be able to support so much more than what he was actually finding. So.
Yeah, I just remember the one where apparently the one expedition broke their altimeter, had all sorts of problems, ended up at the Great Salt Lake and declared it was the San Francisco Bay estuary.
Right. Yeah, there was
it's like, yeah, we made it, not so bad.
Yeah, there was a lot of misidentifying the locations of where rivers joined and things of that nature. It had to have been just, I can't imagine being on that voyage, and it's an epic true history travel adventure story.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions from the group? Oh, Richard. Oh, you're on mute. Still on mute.
John, what was the other Stegner book that you mentioned about mountains?
Men to Match My Mountains. I think that was a fictionalized history. There's lots of it that is very much factual. There's elements of it that we're covering. It's multiple. I think it's three. I think it's three stories within there. One of them had to do with the Virginia Comstock lode. And it is interesting because there's a lot of it is just absolutely factual. But I think there's sort of like these fictionalized characters kind of tying the stories together.
Okay, I'm going to have to look for that one again.
Yeah. Oh, I saw the question posed by Richard, which in the chat is, does the 20-inch minimum mean cannot grow winter wheat or dryland farm?
That it doesn't specify, and I suspect as old as this book is, it's probably changed over the last 70 years as well. But the quote in the book just said it was the minimum for unaided agriculture.
Yeah, and in the 100th meridian, having worked in water resources it's funny because I've worked at College Station, Texas, Manhattan, Kansas, and Brookings, South Dakota. So I was a little east of the 100th meridian of that. And the phrase we used to use there is, where's the 100th this year? And that would just refer to a balance between precipitation and what amounted to effective evapotranspiration during the growing season. And when you go up to the northern plains, 20 inches is a fairly effective balance. But when you go down to, say, College Station, Texas, it's more in the 33-inch range. And so I think Powell's generalization was fairly accurate. And kind of what it meant is you had enough precip to get a crop and get it productive. But it also is not a hard and fast rule, because obviously the further south, the warmer it is, the more ET to balance the water demands of crop production, the further north, and less. But it was also kind of interesting in that region, and just looking at the landscape and realizing, over the long haul, right in that 100th meridian range, you sort of had this really even balance between precip and ET, which has some really interesting effects on the landscapes. And, going one direction, you end up with the mountainous west, and going in the other direction, you ended up having much more, how should I say, deeply carved river systems. But in that range, you ended up with these, almost pothole landscapes, because it could never quite figure out whether you had enough water to constantly erode the soil and create river channels, or you didn't, and it was just sort of pond in these little pools and then evaporate. So that's an interesting place to sort of study geomorphology, and especially hydrogeomorphology, because that real close balance between precip and ET that seems to vary from year to year, but over the long haul is average. So anyway. Powell's observations were quite something for the time, considering he did not have a lot of theory to base them on. He just had to use what he saw.
Right. And he had more information about the West than anybody, but people still didn't want, the Western politicians still didn't want to believe him.
Newlands being a great example. I mean, Newlands came after, but still being a great example. The other thing I like to tie in historically to this, so about the time, so this was right before Powell did his great journey, but Kansas had become a state, and there was this expansion of population predicated on, homestead farming. And they had a series of very good wet years. And it's interesting how the human mind can work, because what had happened was the farmers would come in, they'd break the soil, they'd plant a crop, they'd have ample rainfall, turn in a good crop. And then, more farmers would come in, break more soil, and so forth and so on. And so the correlation and the causality that they developed was the rain follows the plow. And there were all these, I mean, literally, there were scientific theories talking about the release of moisture from the soil, and that's the expansion of Kansas. Then the drought hit and kind of wiped out all these farmers. And it took a long time for people to recognize that, no, the farmer follows the plow follows the rain, sort of like the flip of that. And this was the mindset that Powell was working against when he was trying to do his observations in terms of what was really going on in the West. There was this mindset in Manifest Destiny that, in essence, nature would take care of us when we went out. That is, if we broke the ground, we would have ample resources to do the farming. And it took a long time to reverse that. And that was sort of the condition that the politicians were working under, is that there were scientific theories being promoted talking about how increased water supply would follow the farmers moving out west. That was, I mean, we look at it and say, how ridiculous. And it's like, well, that was the narrative that existed at the time. And I worked in Kansas, and I learned the history of it, and it was fascinating. Anyway, so we can move on to our second speaker, I guess, if there's no more questions. Our second book report, which is Mary. There you are, Mary.
Hi, that's me.
So why don't you take over?
Okay, great. I can share I don't have a presentation. I can share my screen here for a minute so you can see what the cover of the book looks like in case you come across it and want to check it out. So I tried to do my best to really represent my company today. So you see behind me, Hawk, and wearing the shirt. So we are in water quality, and the book Ripple Effect, the first third of the book is on water quality. So I lasered in on the book that was kind of most intriguing or impactful to my day-to-day in water quality. So at Hawk, it's a Danaher company. And our mission is to ensure water quality for people around the world. So we're in water analytics. I know Christian and some others who have given recent book reports kind of started off with romance, thriller, mystery, murder. Was not expecting this to do the same. So I'll read opening line from this book and then kind of get into it. But it says 35 feet down on the bottom of a concrete tank filled with millions of gallons of bitterly cold water lay a body. The tank's 50-pound lid was slightly askew. Kind of goes on. There was some shattered glass from beakers. Day and a half later, they discovered that their head chemist was missing and discovered that their head chemist was at the bottom of their 1-million-gallon drinking water tank for a city of 10,000 people in an up-and-coming suburb in New Jersey. So this drinking water facility in New Jersey, it purifies 83 million gallons of water a day. So once this discovery was made, this set off some major alarms for water quality. And I think that here in the West, we talk a lot about access to water or water scarcity, and even many parts of the world, that's where the conversation really revolves. Aging infrastructure and kind of really just the inner workings and mechanics of the systems for drinking water and wastewater in different parts of the United States and really around the world. We don't often think about how fast water quality can become a crisis. And so this book kind of has more of that angle around water quality and in the municipalities for drinking water and wastewater. So it was a day and a half before this was discovered. As you may expect, it went right into a boil order. But it says here, the most pressing question around Angara's death was how could a body enter the drinking supply in the nation's most densely populated region remain undetected for a day and a half without sounding any alarms? And the answer was that in the tank, the sensor designed to warn of any change in water displacement wasn't working. So when she fell in or was pushed into the tank, there was no alarm sounded to warn that something weighing 175 pounds had just entered the water. It could just as easily been 175 pounds of cyanide or a biological weapon, just as easy as it was a body. So if a body could contaminate millions of gallons of drinking water with no warning, then what other contaminants might lie unidentified in the drinking water supply? And it talks about water, kind of sets the stage for the book. The water, as we all know, is considered an access resource, meaning one that underlies all others. Every time we use water, even for the most mundane tasks, such as washing our hands, hosing our lawns, using electricity, it sets off a ripple effect and with wide and deep consequences. Chemicals in your soaps, impacts and interdependencies with waterways. Then it goes into herbicides and ag, and there's a lot of factors into the equation, and it can be very, very complex to manage. So hence the title, Ripple Effect, right? Okay, some other fun facts. This is kind of, there's a portion here of setting the stage around quality and our federal government, local and state government regulations, and the EPA. There is a lot of studies, and most of you are probably, more knowledgeable in this space than I am, but many studies between 2004 and 2009 conducted by the Environmental Working Group, nonprofit watchdog. And the long and short of that is the studies kind of concluded that over 53 million Americans at the time had high levels of contamination in their drinking water. And let's see, by 2008, the world's consumption of water was doubling every 20 years, which is more than twice the rate of the population growth. And it kind of gets into how we use water and how we contaminate water, and our aging infrastructures that aren't keeping up with population growth and being able to manage pollutants. So the safety of our drinking supplies, there's a rise in nitrogen-fueled dead zones, the fragility of water tunnels and levees, proliferation of ambitious water pipelines, conflicts over privatization and bottled water, resource wars centered on water, and innovations that could save us from drowning or dying from thirst. It gives this book is heavy on case studies. So my recommendation would be, if you're looking for specific samples, and especially from the lens of managing water, water quality, and some of those interconnected pieces of the ripple effect of water on our environment and people groups, specifically for municipal drinking water and wastewater. This is a book that has a lot of examples, and kind of interweaves these case studies. Says, so what is water quality? This is the work that Hawk is in. Refers to the concentration of different constituents found in water, such as oxygen, sediment, nutrients, organisms, toxins, organic matter, and the like. And then it kind of comes into some descriptions of how that comes. So groundwater, surface water, physical, chemical aspects of water, temperature, composition, water pollution, naturally occurring water pollution, non-naturally occurring water pollution, microorganisms. Painting the picture here for some complexities. And then we get into the fun part here, which is wastewater. So if drinking water wasn't complex enough, then it moves into municipal wastewater. Hawk, my company, we have some really clever slogans. Unfortunately, we did not get the trademark fast enough in time, but there's another company that's in water quality and sells a lot into analytics for wastewater. And their tagline is, "We are number one with your number two." And so there are whole companies and markets specifically for managing wastewater. And now, as you know, and the book kind of gets into this, the innovations and evolutions of managing wastewater and reuse. But Americans produce about, if you didn't think you were going to learn about poop this morning, here we go. We're just getting right into it. Fun facts for your friends and kids at dinner. Americans produce about 18 million tons of feces a year, and treatment plants process about 34 billion gallons of wastewater per day, according to the EPA. Effluent from sewage plants, big contributor to nitrogen to New York's waters, as in the case of treatment plants across the country. Heavy nitrogen loads, lack of DO, dissolved oxygen, the death of fish, and growth of algae. A lot of complexities here. And then you probably know, where does a lot of wastewater go? It goes back into our rivers, and it can be one of those ripple effects where increases in nitrogen, phosphorus, and that's where regulations can really do some good. And there's been a tightening and an increase, especially in industrial regulations over the past 10 years, to increase and improve the water quality of our rivers from industrial discharges. But states are doing a good job of enforcing provisions of the Clean Water Act. They should be commended, given the many constraints, such as a small budget and expanding number of polluters. But it is, as this book describes, it's one step forward and two steps back. We're not able to kind of manage the growth and the pull that's needed from our municipal drinking and wastewater facilities to keep up with the growth of populations and how consumers are using water. So I'll close us off with a quote from Leonardo da Vinci. "When you put your hand in a flowing stream, you touch the last that has gone before and the first of what is still to come." And that's a really great quote. And the next part of the book for water quality, it kind of gets into reuse, which that is a really exciting and interesting space, and one of which Hawk and other companies that are in water quality and purification are starting to learn more about, and to invest innovation and technology, not only in real-time control, but specific applications for reuse. All right, ripple effect. Go get your copy today. Oh, one last thing. This is just something so cool I came across just 2 weeks ago, and I thought I have to share this with my cohort. So this is, my mom mailed it to me. I don't know if it's probably let me flip my screen off. So There you go. All right, if you can see this, so this is in Ottumwa, Iowa. I know we had some shout outs to Iowa. This is my uncle who back in the 70s worked a few decades as he had no college education, just on the job training, but worked his way up to be the head chemist of their Ottumwa Water Works. And it's a whole newspaper article all about my uncle in water quality. And I really had he died about 20 years ago, and I had no idea he was on the front page of the local paper for testing water quality. And I just thought, it's amazing how some things kind of come full circle and you see all these connections. It was pretty cool. And here we are today.
Mary, that's a great report. I do have a question for you since you're in that business. We're hearing a lot in the news about PFAS. You want to talk? Can you just talk a little bit about that?
So is that the phosphorus?
No, it's a class of chemicals that are considered forever chemicals, and they are obviously used in a lot of materials that are supposed to last forever. And so, my goodness, and the biggest case so far I understand had to do with PFAS chemicals that were in fire suppressants that were used in fire training exercises in the Air Force Base down by Clovis, New Mexico, that resulted in contamination of a groundwater supply that a dairy is using and shut the dairy down. But now that they're testing, they're finding them everywhere. I mean, everywhere, literally everywhere. And I believe EPA has punted on putting up standards, unless I've heard something differently lately, that they don't really have water quality standards like they do for lots of other organic chemicals. And it's become a big point of discussion.
And what are the main applications where this would be tested or found?
And Mary, we can still see your screen.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. Well, we can all look at it.
Okay.
I think it's in a lot of plastics. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah, it's not just a lot of plastics. I mean,
it's the nonstick cookware.
It's fire suppressants. It's boy, I think like in various cleaning products, I think in polishes for wood floors and granite counter. I mean, it's kind of amazing how ubiquitous they are in so many products across, almost everything we do. And there's some where the products that they're in are fairly stable and they don't enter the environment, but there's lots where they do enter the environment in very small amounts. And there's a lot of discussions on the health impacts and EPA regulation and what the regulations should be. And then you get to the real point. It's like, okay, so you set the regulations and how do you get it out of the water supplies? And that's going to be the tricky discussion. And that's where I think things stand with that right now. And I do not think EPA has taken any real substantive action on this other than they're going to study it some more, unless somebody has some updated information on that.
There are some grants out now to kind of look at that a little bit further. I know Colorado Rural Water Association is kind of leading some of those charges. But a lot of recent studies in the past years that were voluntary, that were largely fire departments that were looking at all products that they were using. But there are differing levels of grant funding for communities to either correct it, fix it. But as you mentioned, it's more in the southern part of the state than the northern part of the state, in large part tying back to New Mexico. So I think Paso County is one of the larger ones that has seen that effect.
Yeah, and it seems like from what I've been able to track, when you look at large military base operations, because they're used in fire suppressants, because they're used in heavy machinery cleaning, because of all of those things, that if you want to identify a location where you'd say, I bet there's PFAS in the water supply, just go near a big military base. And this has been true across New Mexico and Texas, and I'm assuming it's probably true in Colorado and across a lot of the U.S. It's not the only place it's being found, but the military seem to be, I don't know if they're heavier users than anybody else, but because they're concentrated in such a small area, that they tend to have problems with PFAS in and around military bases.
Have they been phased
That's
out?
interesting. We'll look into it.
Have they been phased out of firefighting foam though? I was under the impression that the supplies that are out there now, once they're used up, they weren't creating additional fire suppression foam with that material. I know that it's been found in a lot of the oil and gas fires, wherever it's been used by the fire department around this area. It's been found in some levels.
I would just notice that we've got some more information on places to go for that, for more discussion on that in the chat. So.
Yeah, and we've managed to use all the time, and hopefully, I believe Shirley is not on the call today. I sort of set this up anticipating we'd have 2 book reports today, and I just realized.
Yeah, I don't think she hopped on.
Yeah, okay. And so now we're at time. And so this is a good discussion, and anybody who wants to learn more about the PFAS issue, please use the links that are in the chat. And so now we're going to move on, and we're going to have, I guess we call it Ditch Company Perspectives. It's Andy Pineda. He's with the Larimer and Weld Irrigation Company. And so Andy, why don't you grab the screen, share your screen, and give us your presentation.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, John, for that introduction, and Benton for doing all the organizing of all of us today. So, yeah, thanks so much for having me today. I didn't know exactly where and what you wanted to discuss. I did a presentation, I think, to the group last year, so I think I'm going to stick to that, which is more about ditch companies in general. And some of the history that goes along with all these companies. And I find that kind of fascinating. Throughout my career, I've always enjoyed reading up on the history of how water was developed in Colorado, and it's kind of nice to be part of that towards the end of my career here. Just before I get started, though, I was interested in Scott's book report there and about the history that he talked about with the book he was giving his presentation on, and that's kind of neat that this group kind of gets into the history of water development, and also on just with Mary on the last speaker. I really like that family story about your uncle, so I think you have it in your blood, so that's good. So I'll get started with kind of how mutual ditch companies are formed and what they're about. And they're just generally formed for the purpose of furnishing water to their shareholders. And they are generally a not-for-profit company. So, and they're governed through some statutes that are through the state of Colorado that govern mutual ditch companies as well as others. So as far as, the water portion of ditch companies, they distribute water on what's called a pro rata basis. Simply put, that's means that if you own more shares, you get more water. At the same time, if you own more shares, you also are responsible for more of the costs of the companies, as most companies will assess costs for staff and time and equipment and all the things that go into running these companies. Companies are governed by a board of directors that are elected. The board will also determine and set bylaws that govern the companies and some of their operations. They can also, propose rules and policies for all kinds of things, water delivery, share transactions, and the like. And I was just looking this morning down the Poudre Valley here, and I was trying to count up all the different ditch companies, and I stopped at about 20. So there are many of us within the valley here, and that's probably a small number. So there are a lot of ditch companies within the Poudre Valley that function very similar to the way Larimer and Weld does. And so I'll start off with the Lerman Weld Company. And Benton, do I have the ability to share this screen?
You should have screen sharing permissions, yes.
Okay. So what I'm going to do, let's see, I would want to just, can everybody see that? It's a map.
Nope, we're not
Nope.
seeing it.
Okay. Let's see, share content. I have not done this before, so excuse me for not knowing what I'm doing here.
If you click share and then go to window, go after you click window, you should be able to click on the website, like the specific website that you want us to see.
How's that?
There we go.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. This is kind of small, and like I started out with, I really don't have a PowerPoint presentation for you all, but I just wanted to give you an idea of the Lerman Weld, what we call the Lerman Weld system, which is kind of a conglomeration of several companies, other ditch companies that work in coordination with each other. So this map here kind of shows the extent of the system. And if you can kind of see the hand that I have on the screen, can you all see the hand that I'm waving around here?
I'm not seeing it.
Okay, well, maybe it's just for me. So I think the reason I put this map together is just to give you the extent of our geographic area. So the Lerman Weld Canal, the main canal, starts in northwest Fort Collins, basically at the intersection, if you all know where Shield Street is, just north of the Poudre River there. That's basically where our turnout is from the river. And our canal is about 70, in total, it's over 75 miles long when you include all laterals and the main ditch. The company, the Lerman Weld Irrigation Company, got started by a gentleman known as B.H. Eaton. And I hope within your studies and all your work and presentations of the water leaders that you've had the opportunity to maybe learn a little bit about Mr. Eaton, because he was quite the entrepreneur that developed this system and many other irrigation systems within the valley. At one time, he was our governor. He served as governor from 1885 to 1887. There's a book called Written in Water, authored by Jane and Lee Norris. I believe it's out of print. It's a really neat story of his, it's a biography of his life, and it's a pretty interesting read, and a majority of it is about kind of water development. And so Mr. Eaton was very, he came to this area from the Midwest. He was actually an Ohioan and came out here in the mid 1800s, and much like Powell, thought that all this desert land needed was some water on it to kind of grow productive crops. And so he envisioned this much larger system, irrigation canal, that would deliver water out to what are called the benchlands outside of the river valley. There were good soils, and his idea that all it needed was water was correct. And so he ended up purchasing a bunch of land just east of Fort Collins and began digging this canal, and quite the effort in digging this canal. And it started in I believe about 1878 when construction started. So you can imagine no real mechanized, vehicles and that such. It was all done by, digging with shovels and using horses and slips to kind of carve this canal out. So quite an ambitious endeavor. And his idea was to develop the canal. He owned all the lands and was, it was an investment for him. So he was going to then sell those lands to settlers and folks that wanted to farm out in this country. So quite an endeavor. The canal was substantially finished by 1881. The company was incorporated in 1879, so we've got quite a history there. Presently, the Lehrman-Weld irrigation system irrigates about 60,000 acres or so in this valley. We have the company has direct flow water rights with priority dates from 1864 to about 1878, and as the more lands were kind of developed, more appropriations were made as they went along. So quite a bit there for that piece. We have the crops that are grown out in our service area are primarily forage crops at the present time. Right now, there's quite a bit of acreage of corn and alfalfa. There's still a number of sugar beets. Sugar beets were big in this area. That would be a good topic for you to go back and look into for your group, is to look at the sugar beet industry and from the very beginning when people settled here. There's wheat that's grown, edible beans are a crop as well. We have some vegetables that are grown in certain areas where farmers can get well water. We have onions and carrots, so we have some high produce value crops in the service area. There's also some triticale that is grown mostly for a cover crop. These crops and others, they're supporting a lot of the industries in the Eaton Greeley area, mostly CFAs or confined feeding operations, both for dairies and feedlots. So I think there's more cows than people out in Weld County, so we're endeavoring to support all that. And then, locally, all the jobs that are created off these other kind of industries. So I'll pause there in case there's, any questions, Benton, that people have, at least as part of the kind of Lehrman-Weld system, and then I'll move on to a couple other ditches that are associated with these companies.
There was a quick question in chat from Heidi. If you're able to see that, I could read it if not.
Okay, if you wouldn't mind reading it, that'd be great.
Yeah, she's asking if the purple line on the map was representing future ditches from that prior view that you had.
Okay, good question. So you're looking out here.
The purple and the brown, like you had some other colors that weren't in the legend, and I was just curious if that's like what's to come or what's planned or approved. Are they already approved, or what's the status?
No, that's a good question. Those are laterals. So those are smaller ditches that are connected to the main canal. So this purple area out here, all out in this region, is one fairly large lateral. Like I said earlier, Mr. Eaton built the ditch in pieces as more and more land kind of was brought into production. And so this purple piece at the end was one of the last additions to the main canal system. So all those colors are just other ditches that turn off the main ditch.
So Andy, I have a question. You talked about shares. But you have to have a water right to divert the water out of the river. So does the ditch company have that water right then?
Yes. So, and that's a good question, Jennifer. Yes, most municipal or most mutual ditch companies are associated with water rights, whether those are direct flow or reservoir storage rights. So, like I said, Lehrman-Weld has, I believe we have like 4 main direct flow water rights, ranging in priority dates 1864, which is very good. That's a very good water right. It's not very big, but again, very senior, up to our 1878s, which are, believe it or not, are pretty junior on this river system. When you have an 1878, when the river is high, of course, we get plenty of water, but that 1878 drops out pretty quickly when, as the river hydrograph drops. So
it's fair to say that you divert, the ditch companies divert under their water rights, but then once it gets in the ditch, you distribute by shares. Is that
Correct.
how that works?
Correct. And actually, it's the shareholders that own the specific water right in, in a mutual setting. So the ditch company is just there as a fiduciary to distribute the water. Shareholders pay us to make sure that happens, and any other business that the company might be involved in.
Thanks, Andy.
Can I ask a quick question too?
Sure.
Andy, this is Dave Thorpe with Hartford. We were working on the Springer project a couple years ago together.
Sure. Yeah. Good to see you.
So far on Water Literate, we haven't talked much about the difference between reservoir shares and ditch shares, but that's something that, Hartford swims in a lot. So I wondering if you could kind of touch on the different kinds of water and when they are available, et cetera.
Sure. In fact, that was my next kind of section I was going to talk about. Dave, I was going to get into the kind of the reservoir side of this company, which is pretty expansive. So there are two other main companies associated with the Lehrman Weld companies, and that would be the Lehrman Weld Reservoir Company, which operates Terry Lake, which is I'll try to center that on my screen. So Terry Lake is kind of right here in the middle of the screen if I'm set up right. That reservoir company was incorporated in 1890, so it goes back quite a ways. About 8,000 acre feet of capacity. And it has storage priorities of 1890, 1895, and 1905. And so a storage right is basically just another right on the river. Typically, they are junior or come behind senior direct flow rights. So reservoirs were developed later in this valley. They first developed kind of close to the river bottom. Mr. Eaton was one of the first ones that tried to take water outside that boundary. And in doing so, they quickly realized that the river didn't last very long. And so that limited, A, the amount of water, and B, the amount of crops and the type of crops you could grow. So therefore, they looked for other ways to stretch the water supply, and they were able to do that by creating reservoirs. So if any of you have driven north of Fort Collins, you go through those, drive up north there, and you'll see all these lakes. In fact, you see all these lakes up there, and they're all involved with different irrigation and reservoir companies. The other big company that is associated with Lehrman Weld is what we call the WRCC, which is formerly the Windsor Reservoir and Canal Company. And that's highlighted, their canal is highlighted in green here on my screen. And that canal is primarily to fill 3 reservoirs north of Fort Collins, Douglas Reservoir, reservoirs number 8 and 8 Annex, and Cobb Lake. And Windsor Reservoir, which is down here north of Windsor, which many of you might be familiar with. I'll try to move over here. This is kind of in your territory, Dave. Windsor Reservoir is also associated with that company. In fact, Windsor Reservoir was, I think, one of the first 3 reservoirs that were developed in the valley. Again, by Mr. Eaton. He owned that property. And the interesting thing about this lake is it sits below the Lehrman Weld Canal. So we can't get water directly. We can't release water right from the reservoir into the ditch. So you might be scratching your head thinking, well, how in the world does that work? And this valley was developed upon a lot of trades between these various ditches and reservoir companies. So this reservoir is primarily used by the ditch below us, the Newcastle-Laputer Irrigating Company, and we trade water with them. So there are times when they have water and we don't, and so we will make a trade or an exchange, and they get our water and we get theirs. So And that happens a lot in this valley. It happens a lot in the South Platte of exchanges and trades. And that's how we are able to, by gravity, move water around from the different systems. The Windsor Reservoir, or the WRCC company, was also incorporated in 1890, so it's got a long history, and it's one that again, I just love the history of these companies because there were a lot of successes in developing these ditch companies, and there were a lot of failures. In fact, they're about even between the successes and failures. And when there is a failure, a lot of times the assets of that company that went under or just couldn't make it are available for sale. And if you look in our history, the Windsor company picked up pretty much all these reservoirs to the north here. They picked up through different mechanisms and stuff. They picked up Douglas Reservoir. Cobb Lake was a big lake out there. In fact, it's the biggest lake in the valley as far as storage capacity. And these Windsor's number 8 and 8 Annex were also picked up in some trades with, I believe, North Poudre Irrigation Company. So throughout these histories of these companies, I mean, they're very opportunistic about getting, more water, securing better rights, protecting those rights. I know what I do. Most of my job is kind of protecting these rights. But there's some really good history out there with the way these companies are developed. And it's, to me, it's just fascinating to know that, 160 years ago, they were faced with the same problems I'm kind of seeing today. So David, I don't know, that was a pretty long-winded answer there, but I did that kind of cover your question about reservoir shares and the like. They're still administered, via the state of Colorado still administers all those based on, your place in line. They're still decreed for certain types of uses. All our uses are primarily irrigation. We haven't gone through yet a change case of any of these systems. We don't know how much longer we can stay that way, but we haven't gone through a change of water rights. So we're primarily still geared up to deliver water to ag.
Yeah, I didn't mean to jump on your presentation.
Oh, that's okay. No, I was
Push you to
headed
the
that
next
way
section.
anyway.
I guess one thing that is significant for us with our non-potable systems that perhaps you could touch on is like the delivery windows of the different kinds of water.
Okay.
Because that is kind of fascinating when
Yeah.
what kind of water is available.
Okay, great. Yeah. So, and I was going to kind of finish up with our issues that are facing at least our companies and probably others as well. So some of the issues that we're facing right now are aging infrastructure. As I mentioned, we've been in the business for 100 and going on 160 years, and I hate to say it, but there's still pieces of our system that are probably that old and need some repair. But we have to cover replacement costs. Things are very expensive, as you probably all know. Things are very expensive these days in terms of having things done and purchasing. We face some difficulty in water operations. We are operating with less water than we have historically had available to these companies. We've seen a fairly large migration of CBT water. That's another reservoir water that's available to be run into these systems. And these companies at one time, I believe, had close to 40,000 units of CBT, and that is now, for different reasons, been moved out of the system and generally gone to the municipal sector. So, there's maybe 30,000 acre feet that Lerman Well doesn't have access to that it once did. So that's a struggle, is to try to go back to the old way of how these companies delivered water in terms of how much they have is a challenge. We're challenged by droughts, water quality. I heard Mary talk a lot about water quality. We have a great water quality right now, and we like to try to keep it that way. Putting really good water quality on these soils out here really helps. We don't have a lot of issues with salinity or that kind of any kind of elements that are dangerous for crop production. In just my short time here, I've seen some hydrology changes in terms of river runoff and climate change, which could change the timing of deliveries, shifting that time when crops are grown, either maybe earlier or later, just kind of depending on what's grown out there. Different types of crops and cropping patterns will certainly go along with that. Our on-farm irrigation systems, we're seeing a pretty good movement from flood delivery systems, siphon tubes and the like, and more moving to sprinkler irrigation. And we have a fair amount of land by certain shareholders that are in drip. So they're able to make drip irrigation work. So you're seeing this pretty big increase in application efficiency and less, which means maybe a little more consumptive use, more consumptive use of the water itself, and maybe even less return flows from our applications. So our windows of delivery on direct flow will generally, for this company, because our rights are pretty junior, typically start about the third week of May. And our river run, as we call it, will last as long as the river can support it, which is then dependent on, snowpack and rain and the like. But typically it'll get us to maybe the second or third week of June. So maybe roughly a month of river run, as we call it. And then this company kind of makes a big switch and moves over to what we call reservoir. So we try to make a black and white distinguishing mark there, although it's pretty gray as far as when you move over, because you just have the switch doesn't necessarily just flip off. But we'll transition to what we call our reservoir run, and that's where we are then releasing out of all these different reservoirs I mentioned before, and also the little bit of CBT we have left in Horsetooth. In that window, again, we'll start maybe the third week of June, and then we try to make it, if we have the supply to do so, we try to make it to probably about the first or second week of September. And that's kind of our pattern. I will say we would like to move into the non-pot delivery arena. I think that's something these ditches can do, and I think for you municipal providers is something that I'm seeing more of course, because of just the availability of water supplies. It makes a lot of sense to just kind of keep a non-pot system going. I will say this though, expectations on a non-pot, don't expect it to be like a municipal delivery system where you can just go turn it on and it's there. I like the non-pots, but they have to also realize that there's a certain expectation, I think, for your customers that you should put out there and just say, hey, we may not be able to irrigate until this company is up and running. And so you're just gonna, that's kind of just living within those boundaries. There's water there, and there's maybe some things that as part of the development can help stretch that water supply if you need to kind of push it to the, kind of the fringe areas. I'm also seeing in a lot of developments and a lot of things coming from cities that they are changing a lot of their landscape requirements. So I think bluegrass has kind of got a bullseye on it right now in certain areas. And some towns even have you know, payback, you know, take turf out for dollars kind of thing. So, and change that landscape kind of view. So, I like the non-pot idea. I think keeps our ditch running, keeps water in the canal. But just have to realize there are some limitations there that we have to provide for all shareholders, and just not, you know, special situations and cases.
Andy, we had 2 questions. One of those from Richard was, are there other types of ditch companies than mutual ditch companies, like non-mutual ditch companies, etc.?
Yes. You can have, if I've seen, and there are still some, I think even in this valley, where maybe it's just a couple individuals that have, you know, been the successors of maybe a smaller ditch, and where it's more of a, you know, a partnership of some sort, and not necessarily a full-blown, you know, company. Those will typically happen, I think, with kind of smaller endeavors where you're not, you know, trying to serve thousands of acres. So you can have those situations where, you know, it might be, you know, like a neighborhood or something like that, or just a, you know, maybe a smaller farming operation that's been lucky enough to get into a smaller ditch system where they can, you know, they're kind of in charge of that, as long as they, you know, own the water right and have all those, you know, decrees, and are still within the beneficial uses of those decrees. Yeah, they can have at it.
Gotcha. And the last question I saw was, do you have like 1 or 2 common examples of how you protect water rights for Larimer and Weld irrigation?
Yeah, good question. I've spent a majority of my career in my different places of work protecting water rights. I think I've protected more water rights than I've actually applied for and gotten new water rights for. So in the water right world, there's constant change going on. So there's new water rights that are applied for. There's older rights that are changed. And when you go through a change, you have to put on notice, or you are put on notice, that there's a change coming. You have the ability to get in that case or oppose the case, depending on if, you know, if the ditch is right next to you, or the water right could have some impacts to the way your operation is managed. You can oppose that application and kind of get within the court system to be notified of, well, here's what the decree is going to look like. If they did an engineering study on the change, here's what the engineers came up with. So it allows you kind of a forum to, you know, either just be noticed for one, and get knowledgeable about the situation and whether or not it's going to cause you injury. And that's the main thing. You know, let's say you know, water right gets applied for and it's upstream of you, and they're planning to take all the water in the river. Well, that's going to injure you downstream. So you're going to want to get in there, and you're going to want to make sure that, you know, their water right is, you know, in the right place, you know, in the right time, and that there's no kind of material change to how you have always accessed your water right. And that's how you do that. And it involves a lot of engineering, a lot of attorneys, negotiations if you get to that point. You work with a judge, the district court in Greeley, there's a water court judge. So it can get involved. It gets expensive, as you might imagine. But yeah, you have to stay in tune with that, because if you don't, there's not, and something goes and you don't know about it, and you know, it ends up hurting you. Well, that's bad on you for not kind of paying attention to that kind of stuff.
So we've kind of hit our time limit on this, and
okay.
So I want to thank you for your presentation, and we will have chances in future meetings, and everybody has your contact information if they want to follow up and get in more discussions with you on that. And
Okay.
thank you.
Well, thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you for that perspective on ditch, and I guess I'd say reservoir companies too. You put a little of that in there, so thank you. So I sort of need an applause button for team, but anyway, okay. So we are going to swing in right to our next speaker, and Jennifer, you know her a bit more, and so I would like you to do the introduction for Mayor Jenny Arndt, the mayor of the city of Fort Collins. So
I would be pleased to do that. Mayor Arndt, thank you so much for joining us. She is an educator and then decided to run for the legislature and became one of our water heroes in her terms at the legislature. Decided she was going to learn all she could about water and spent a couple of years going to all kinds of meetings. And Jenny is also known for being a convener, and she would bring difficult conversations together and help guide those conversations as we were looking at different pieces of legislation and just water policy. After leaving the legislature, she decided she still liked politics, and she ran for mayor for Collins. With that, Jenny, if there's anything more you want to add, that's fine. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. And I'm going to clear up those two misconceptions, Jennifer, although I appreciate it. I didn't decide, other people decided for me. So when people ask me to run for office, I'm like Gilligan, right? You can't make me, you can. And then I do it. So, but thank you. That's how some people get in. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be at Water Literate Leaders, and I appreciate you guys opting in to learn more about water. So I'll be brief. I think I'm going to hit on three things, sort of. Jennifer touched a little on my personal background, and then I'm going to tell you my water journey, and because they don't fit very well. And then I'm going to just talk a little bit about, if you want to know what Fort Collins is doing, I'll tell you, but we can always send you that stuff. And then something, I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to be, I guess people call me a water leader. I don't know. Or how about a leader who's interested in water? I think that's better. So my personal story is, as Jennifer said, I mean, I came to Fort Collins when I was 3 weeks old, all the way up from Boulder. So, but I did leave for 24 years. And in that time, I did a lot of stuff, right? Peace Corps. And then I have 3 children. My husband's an economist. Then we lived in Mozambique for 6 years, where really the kids had their formative years. And when it was time to leave Mozambique, my husband was working for the UN, and we could live really anywhere in the world. And I was in higher ed by then, but I was an early adopter on the online gig because of my personal circumstance living in Mozambique and being a mother of 3. So all those things came together, and my husband said, can we just move back to your hometown? Because your mom's there, she'll help you. And I'm going to travel like 3/4 of the year. Great. So that brought me home. And that's when my political journey started, because these people remembered me and then came at me. So I didn't know that my high school teacher would be Bob Bacon. I knew he was Bob Bacon, but I didn't know he was going to be our school board rep senator. I didn't know my 8th grade teacher was on school board. And I didn't know they were going to come to my house and fight over which thing I was going to run for, school board or state rep. So I watched them duke it out. And I've been on 2 school boards. And honestly, because I'm a special education person and I get so emotional about that issue, I lost a molar every time I was on a school board. And I said, I only have 2 left. So I think I'll run for state rep because maybe I won't lose another molar. And when I got to the Capitol, I specifically asked not to be on the education committee, and they thought I was crazy. And they said, why? Because I had invested my entire career on that. And I said, I just want to be a good legislator. I'm too biased. I will actually lose my mind if someone takes money away from a special education student. I cannot see 2 sides of this issue. I've been in the role of expert, and that was my role. The role of legislator is not the role of expert. I said, could you just put me on the ad committee? Because I think I could be really fair and balanced about that. And they said, sure, okay. And my predecessor, Randy Fisher, was on the ad committee, and he was chair. So that kind of leads into, that's where I became, but my PhD is relevant because it's in language and linguistics, and those words matter so much, right? You really know how to communicate with people and with a careful word choice, right? So I just didn't call myself a water leader. I said a leader who's interested in water. Those are important things because when you're communicating, you want to be reaching your audience and have them reach out to. So Randy Fisher and I went on a bike ride one day, and he said, you know, Jenny, if you get elected, and because he said there's not going to be a lot of water knowledge at the Capitol, would you consider taking on that issue? And I said, yeah. So I've always been an eager student. I've got lots of higher ed degrees. I said, this is a really meaty, good topic for me. So Jennifer's right. I traveled all around the state. I followed the water committee. Nobody knew. I just sat in the back. I brought my little sleeping bag. And then when they'd be at a hotel, I'd be out at the KOA. And then I'd go in and I'd listen to all the meetings. And I did that for a long time. And then I did a lot of other equally crazy things to learn as much about water. A lot of times calling and relying on people like Jennifer Gimbel, people like Eric Wilkinson. I'm interested, would you share your knowledge? Of course, it was easier once I got elected because then, oh no, she's going to have a vote. We better, yeah. Sometimes you don't get a lot of traction when you're a candidate, which is fine, right? So I spent a lot of time and I think I read Water Law for Non-Water Lawyers 200 times. I have a copy at Fort Collins and one in my Denver place, and I have one on my iPhone, so I can just remind myself when I'm on an airplane. Those things are important, that basic knowledge, right? So I served 7 years in the legislature, 3 as chair of ag, 1 year as chair of the water committee, but I was on the water committee for 7 years. The governor has recently, last year, put me on the Water Quality Control Commission. Colorado Water Congress very nicely made me a lifetime member, so I get to go to all the conferences forever and ever. And that was just one of the honors of my lifetime. So now I'm going to talk about a little more about that just sets the context. And here's my little water journey. So after the bike ride and not after the learning continues, but while that was happening, after I got elected, I picked up a bill that had failed at the legislature that was Randy Fisher's, called the Flex Water Bill. And it failed miserably. Democrats voted against it. I mean, no, it is, but I heard about it. I thought this is such an intuitively appealing idea about helping farmers who own just an ag water right go and do a change case, as the former speaker discussed, and get a fundamentally new water right in Colorado. Jumping forward 3 years, it passed. It's called the Colorado Ag Water Protection Act. And while he was speaking, I was thinking, those farmers. So what it does is it allows you to retain your water right and have a lot more flexibility so you can use it. To this date, I don't think anyone's used it. Not that I know of, but it's coming, right? So here's how I got that bill passed. I ran it as a freshman and everyone laughed at me, which was fine. And I'm learning, right? So I went to Water Congress the next year and I said, would a group of you guys lend your expertise to me and tell me really what's wrong with this bill? Not politicians, but the experts. And no one wanted to come to that meeting. And it was Friday, the last of them. And then one guy really bravely was like, well, maybe this person's serious about listening. And he goes, I'll come. And then Chris Treese from the River District said, I'll come. And then we got Ducks Unlimited. And then all of a sudden he said, well, maybe we'll give her an hour. Maybe she really wants feedback. And they did. I wanted to know what am I seeing that seems so intuitively appealing? It's like a market-based, like a voluntary approach to water sharing that people can do if they want, makes their water more valuable, keeps water in ag when you need it. It just, what's wrong? And then one guy really bravely, a guy from Ducks Unlimited, Greg Kernahan, lives in Fort Collins. He goes, well, why does it say that? So I don't know. What would you like it to say? And then I could feel the room turn when I just kept asking questions. Not the expert, clearly. Really, and people in the water community are so generous with their time and expertise. And then finally, Chris Treese is like, well, we're always going to oppose this. I said, okay. I get it. So in my mind, my world, I count those legislators off my vote count. Okay. And say this would pass one day, what would you do? He goes, well, it'd be better if you, right? That bill started, we renamed it the Colorado Ag Water Protection Act. Ducks Unlimited National picked it up as one of their signature issues for that year. They stationed a lobbyist in Denver specifically to help get that bill passed. It really helped that guy's Republican because it wasn't a partisan issue. And so we were still in the split legislature. And we just really worked that bill and listened harder. Anyway, it passed. So that's just sort of one of my biggest learnings and takeaways, right? To listen, so I'll give you my little list. To listen hard and sincerely. To always understand all points of view because people are smart. And when they trust you, they'll tell you. To, you do that first. And then you really craft and refine the policy. Don't bring a policy and say, here it is. Build coalitions and allies, right? Work in the realm of the possible, not the perfect. How many things die that, and honestly, I'll be really honest, I say this right out loud, now that we have a supermajority, or the Democrats do, and all these levers, you shouldn't, you still just, I always say, just because you can pass a bill doesn't mean you should. Right? Don't, in my work, I don't do that. Don't do that. And then be flexible and be patient. Patience, right? Like I said, I don't think anyone's used this, but I can hear that there could be a real place for this, okay? So then I'll talk a little bit about leaders, you guys as leaders, and then I'll open to question and answer. I'll stop talking. I would say when I ever had success in the water world is when I really knew my role, right? I know I'm a politician. I'm sorry, that's the word. Who's interested in water? Know your role. I'm not a water expert. I don't know, I know what an acre foot is. Great. But other people have their roles too, right? So, and then I have my little list here. Stop talking and listen. Respect your elders. People who came before us were very, very smart, right? They did things for a reason at the time that they needed to because they thought it was the right thing to do. So that's really important. People call sort of the crusty old white guys the water buffaloes. I love those guys. Look what they did. Look at our state, right? It's good. So trust your elders, learn from them. And then, one day it'll be your turn to be an elder and you'll get to say, what are they doing? Let's see what else. I said, the experts will know where to put the pipes, how to cost the water, how to set up the program, right? In my role, that's not what I do, right? I never will be able to do that. And then I said, kindness goes a long way, and it's also really a road to a very happy life. So that kind of goodwill and hopefully kind-heartedness gets people to the table. And then also, even I had a lot of water bills die, and it's good. It's okay. It's fine. So I want to say that, and then also there was something else along that line. Oh, so here's a very recent example. So I'm gonna be, it kind of made me scared because Doug Kemper of Water Congress asked me to speak next week, and I said, sure. Then I looked at the program, and it's the opening general session. I was like, I'm not sure. There will be hundreds and hundreds of water experts in the room. What can you possibly add to that conversation? So he set it up, so it'll be myself and a mayor from Grand Junction and a mayor from Alamosa. And, we just had a pre-meeting is, let's stay in our lane, you guys. You don't, there will be experts in the room who know all the other stuff. What do we do as leaders, right? And that's what we're going to talk about. So I think that'll be, a good thing. That's really what I had written down in my notes to you. And then I would like to open it up for questions. And if anyone wants to know what Fort Collins is working on, I'm happy to talk about that. And CDPHE is in the process of adopting rules for direct potable reuse. So when I ran the bill to do the purple pipe, sort of expand the uses for water reuse, you know, my biggest fight was CDPHE. I was like, come on, you guys are in the dark ages. You don't have to do water reuse, but I'm just saying you can expand the number of places you can do this. And it gets cleaned up to 1987 potability standards. So what's the bug? So I think we've sort of pierced through that. And I had a tear in my eye a couple months ago at the Water Quality Committee when they voluntarily are making rules for direct potable reuse. I was like, oh, I think I'm going to cry. And the whole coalition for the water reuse bills was there, and they'd reached out to them asking for their expert advice, and they did it together. So I kind of feel like that's great. Those are my opening comments.
Jenny, that's great. What would you consider your biggest challenge on the waterfront in your different areas of expertise between CDPHE and water quantity and
sharing? Regionalism. Regionalism is, you know, all our water systems are bumping into each other, right? Yeah. Our city council has regionalism as a priority. I would tell you, the hardest city to do regionalism in northern Colorado is Fort Collins. It's going to have the biggest problem with that. I keep saying that. It's fundamentally hard to get out of yourself and share. I don't know how to say that, but that's hard, right? So all of our water initiatives in Fort Collins so far have been incentives, right? We will reimburse you to take out your blue gas and put in xeriscape. We will come into water audit. We will, you know, it'll probably get to a point where there'll be some mandates. I don't like those. But right. So I think fundamentally, I'm not a part of it anymore. Maybe Jennifer, you are, the regional strat group that the foundation has been lovely in sponsoring, the convener of that. And those are long, hard conversations, right? So.
Other questions for Mayor Arndt? I promised her this was an active group.
Come on, anything.
Go ahead, just hop in.
You're muted, Brian.
David, you unmuted. You want to go?
Well, Brian was already talking. We'll let him go.
Oh, okay, Brian. Yeah, go ahead.
Just when you get a chance, just update on what's going on in the city of Fort Collins and the dwelling units, and how late did the meeting go last night? And maybe that's why we're missing one of our people here in the.
Oh, did Shirley not make it?
I don't think
She
so.
did make it.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm gonna give her a hard time. We got about 1:30, and then you have to like unwind and kind of calm down. So I think I always look at my watch. It tells me what to do. I think my watch said I fell asleep about 3, but it went long. So we voted to repeal the land development code and not repass or, you know, none of that, and go into just a series of you know, in-depth community conversations on what people want the community to look like. I do think it's a very good conversation, this idea though, because as we go into that conversation, so if those of you don't know, the land development code we passed on November 1st, the signatures were gathered to call the council to either repeal and replace, which we didn't do, or pardon me, or send it to the voters, which I don't think is right now, maybe much. It's also very water wise and climate wise land development code. So during our community meetings, I will make it very clear, what are we going to give up? If we want to continue with single family housing zoning, what part of your climate action are you going to say we're not doing? You know, you can't have both. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you. That was it.
Okay.
David, did you have?
Yeah, kind of hit on potential for future mandates, maybe, but are there other items that City of Fort Collins is looking at, like potable, non-potable systems at a greater scale? You know, we're doing that in Bloom, and working with Andy and Larimer and Weld on that project.
Okay.
So we're pretty intimately in the details on that, but it's a little parochial, right? It's for our real estate with our legal description. What's the city looking at kind of for the future of non-potable around the community?
Well, we passed gray water last summer, and just the opt-in for new development, that's not going to save the world. I do find it interesting that the city initially, staff took a opposed position on that. I said, okay, thanks, we're doing it. It's just optional. They then dropped their opposition. They're like, yeah. We are working, our legal team's working on water adequacy, right? Water, I cannot read my own handwriting. We just had a presentation the other night on like urban water conservation program, more beefed up times 10, right? And that'll more outreach and come probably to us this summer or fall. We have the tiered rate pricing. You know, I suggested possibly that third tier could be increased, right? A little more bite there. I think also what we need to look at is a program similar to the low income assistance plan for energy. We need that for water as water prices increase. Of course, the city's looking at Halligan, and instead of topping up the dam, now the proposal is a brand new dam. I don't know. I am always rather collaborate than fight. So you know, NISP has all the permitting and the record decisions out. Why wouldn't we just put our 8,000 square feet of additional storage we need in Glade? Then we partner with Northern instead of fight with them and see them in court. Those are some of the water things, discussions we're talking about. Not a lot of reuse. We've been using non-potable for a long time on parks and those sorts of things.
Sally, you had did that answer your question about storage plans?
Oh,
a little bit. Hi,
Go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that, about your storage plans. I know you brought it up with us, and I think it's a really good topic, especially with, you know, a lot of the reservoirs happening around us. And Fort Collins is no different.
Sure.
And it can be controversial.
Oh yeah, sure. So there's Fort Collins Mayor Arndt that's listening to that does the city stuff, and then there's like Jenny. So let's make a distinction right now when I talk on this topic, because I'm not representing the city of Fort Collins in this. It's not their stance, right? You know, it just. And the mayor of Grand Junction, I had a good conversation. She goes, I just cannot say climate change in my town. We say resilience. I go, okay. I can't say storage. She goes, okay. I mean, I can, and I do, but you know, those are like these weird buzzwords for people that block out the practical. And as I was saying, you work in the realm of the practical and possible. So I don't know, Sally. I mean, that just makes sense to me. You know, Fort Collins still has years of permitting ahead for the Halligan. We've already had a couple lawsuits with the landowner up there who doesn't want us on his property, even to like site the dam. I was like, how are we going to build a road and run dump trucks? You know, there's some practical. It's also hard to let go of vision that you have, especially if you have some sunk costs. Those are hard things. But if Glade's sitting right there, why wouldn't we have one dam instead of two? And then I would love to partner with Northern. They're very good partners. They're very trustworthy. Of course, they're environmentally conscious. I just think it would be a win-win. But I think that some of those words that have the drum that's been beating for so long in Fort Collins, is hard to reverse that.
Yeah, that's the conversations we're hearing too. I was wondering though, and I forget, someone had told me they they don't use storage for the same reason that you said you can't use storage in certain conversations.
I mean,
but there's a
I do
different
all the
word.
time.
I forget what the word what the word is that they do use. Oh, and it was probably somebody in this group, or that I met at Water Congress or something. But I thought it was really interesting. And but yeah, I mean, like, I know you're probably getting pushback, but to identify, it would be great if you could identify some of the pushback. Like, what's the main opposition to quote unquote storage, right? We all know that we're in
Environmental
a water crisis.
concerns.
Yeah.
Environment. And there are some really great other storage options, right? Aquifer storage recovery's come a long way. They've got this micro trenching. There's a lot of really innovative ideas out there, but the fact of, the idea of saving water always kind of makes me smile, because water is always somewhere. It just, if you zoom out, right, there's it's about getting water where you want it, when you want it, to meet your needs.
Yeah.
All needs,
Thank
right? That means ag, environmental, right? I don't just mean, yeah. So that's the goal. And you have to hold some water back, because the snowpack's not doing it for us anymore. So there's a lot of options out there.
Ben, you've had your hand up. Go ahead and go.
I do. Let me put my hand down. Good morning, everybody. And Mayor Arndt, thank you so much for taking time to visit with our water class today. My question is, as we work a lot with the state demographer. I know you guys do as well. I'm the economic development director over in Greeley, just for reference here. And we're always trying to stay in tune with who our demographics are and who's moving here and from where and from what states. And there's just that whole pressure cooker that growth represents for us as a state, and then as allies here in northern Colorado. And we look at Larimer County versus Weld, and we look at Greeley versus Fort Collins, and what is our ultimate idealized future population state going to look like? What is the latest in Fort Collins in terms of your current population is about 180,000? Does that sound about right?
Yes.
Do you have an idealized future population max that you guys have kind of charted out, saying, look, we've got all these properties entitled thus and such, and we think the density will be this and that, and we think we'll end up at X? What is that number? What is the latest number that you guys are kind of operating under?
250 grand with the growth management area. And that might, with more density, might be more people, but we only have so much land. And the county wants us to, and I suppose there's been an IGA way before me, to annex East Mulberry. Good conversation, not an unusual one, yesterday in my office about land development code, and really get down to brass tacks. And she said, I just don't want anyone else to move here. I said, I know. I said, is that going to happen? She goes, no. I go, okay, let's get off that and talk about this. But she couldn't budge off that point. Couldn't budge off. Every day I drive downtown and I'm mad at the traffic and I'm angry and I'm upset. My neighbors are going to scrape their house and build a mansion or build a duplex. I go, well, that's under the new code. Under the old code, they could build a mansion. What? Oh, yeah. So
Heidi,
just to answer your question, Ben, the growth is hard, but I'd rather manage it. And that's our number.
Sorry to interrupt. I
Thank
think
you.
we have time for one more question. Heidi, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor, for sharing your wisdom with us this morning. My question goes back to one of the things that you mentioned about what you're doing tomorrow or soon, which is, speaking to those around the state and sharing your wisdom with them. I'm thinking about levels of scale and recommendations that you have about how we can all work together. So you mentioned that regionalism is a challenge for us locally. I work for Larimer County, so we're trying to blow it up a little bit and think about regionalism on a county level, recognizing that we do need to have some regional discussions with our sister counties. So, then going up there, and then here you're going to talk to the state level folks about water. So can you share with us, like, what is your pearl of wisdom that you are going to share there that we might be able to manage here on our local regional level, and maybe display some leadership at the state level, that this is how we can do it here. So if you were, what's your leadership pearl of wisdom there that you're recommending how we talk about these issues?
Well, there's no silver bullet, right? I wish I just had an answer, but and it just sounds so dumb to say this, but honestly, I think I got to be ag chair because after my freshman year, I went to everybody's on the committee. I went to their district and I walked a mile in their shoes. What are you saying? What's out here in, Kiowa County? And I was sincere, and it didn't change my votes, or, well, it probably did change my legislation, certainly. Just inside baseball, but Democrats didn't want to make me ag chair because I probably wasn't environmental enough for them, or I didn't scream it enough, or what, I don't know. It was really the Republicans who came and said, this has traditionally been our committee. We want her. So I think, and then the Democrats finally said, okay. I just really empathy. I don't, it's such a dumb, easy thing to say, and minute to learn, lifetime to master. Hard thing to do. I think that authenticity, and then look beyond the issue to the human. And when 20 years from now, what's really going to matter? Is it going to be that relationship you built, or is it really going to be if the pipe was 2.5 foot, whatever people fight over? I'm sorry. I wish I had a better answer.
Well, Jenny, this has been very good, and appreciate you joining us. And you were getting hand claps. You're getting from everyone. So, John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
I'll just say one more thing. I'm going to put my personal number in the chat, and I really mean it. You guys can call or text me anytime.
Oh, thank you. That would be
Sincere.
wonderful.
Okay. Thank you for having me.
Okay, on the schedule right now, we have a break. It was going to be a 20-minute break. Well, it was actually, was that it? Yeah, so why don't we make it a 15-minute break if that's okay with everybody? And so you can turn your cameras off, take a step back, leave your speakers on. So when we come back, and right after the break, we're going to have Brad Bovee, who's the Intermountain Regional Director for Water Research. And he's going to be talking about alternative transfer methods, and I'm assuming about water. And so we will see you all after a short break. See you in a bit. Well, okay, it's time for us to start coming back online. I think, yeah, we're supposed to get going at 11:05. So those of you that are there, start turning on your cameras and your microphones. Give everybody a few minutes to return to the screen. Does anybody know, does Teams have sound effects? I just sort of realized that would be a good addition. You know, you could have the theater ding, ding, ding. Oh, well, okay.
I don't
So
actually
everybody's-
know.
Yeah, we should do that add-on. That would be good. Okay, so we're going to come back and we're going to have a presentation by Brett Bovee, who's, as I said before the break, the Intermountain Regional Director for Wastewater Research, and he's going to be discussing an overview of alternative transfer methods. And after that, we're going to break for lunch. And Benton and Jennifer, I assume that means we're all going to spend 20 minutes grabbing something to eat. We don't have to look at each other eating on the screens. We can if we want, but we don't have to. And then we'll come back to finish up our afternoon session after that. Okay, with that, Brett, are you there? There you are. You can grab the screen and use the share function if you have a presentation and take it away.
Great. Well, thanks for inviting me to speak today on alternative water transfer methods. I'm probably going to tell you more than you want to know about ATMs, but I think it's good context for the overall water discussions you've been having in this series. So I do have slides. I think the visuals are helpful to understand the topics. And just a time check, how long do I have for the presentation and Q&A?
You have it until 12 o'clock, so you've got about 50 minutes.
Oh, awesome. All right. Well, let's get into it. And I would say when I'm presenting, it's really hard to see hands go up or, things like that. So the most effective way to get my attention when I'm presenting is just to speak up, interrupt me, and let's answer your questions along the way. We don't need to hold all questions to the end if you've got a question on something I'm talking about. Sound good? All right, let me share my screen here. Looks like I'm sharing. Yes. Yes. All right. Let me get my slideshow button here. All right. So I got an introduction, so I won't introduce myself again. Here are the things I want to cover today on ATMs. So I want to provide a little background on water and agriculture in Colorado. I want to then move into why this concept of an ATM came about. So state at a policy level and a planning level was seeking an alternative to the dry up of agricultural lands to support water and new uses. So then that's when ATMs kind of came to be as a piece of the water nomenclature in Colorado. Then we'll move into what do ATMs mean? What are some examples? What are some barriers? And then finally, what are some complementary actions that can be taken that aren't ATMs, but might get you to the same point? So first, water and agriculture in Colorado. I'm going to tell you something you probably already have learned in this series, but I think it's just fundamentally important to just realize that when Colorado was settled by white settlers in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, a lot of people came out and farmed. So mining and farming were like the two, I guess, industrial economic drivers of people settling in Colorado. And as a result, a lot of the water rights established in Colorado were for agriculture. So the oldest rights, the most reliable rights, the rights at the best locations pretty much were established for agricultural water use. And that continued even after the ditch companies dug a lot of the ditches along the Front Range with federal reclamation programs. So the Reclamation Act of 1902, I believe, started a series of federal investments in establishing fairly large projects to divert water in the Western US for agricultural purposes, for irrigation projects. So between ambitious settlers establishing ditch companies to federal investments in reclamation programs, a lot of the water was basically appropriated or secured for agricultural uses in Colorado, which is very similar to most of the Western states. So as a result, and as a result of continued investment in agriculture through, certainly through the 1960s and 70s as groundwater pumps came on. This is a picture of water use in Colorado. This is USGS Geological Survey water use data. They publish it every 5 years, but it takes about 3 years for them to get the data out. So I would imagine sometime in 2023, this year, we'll see national water use data for the year 2020, because it usually takes them about 3 years to publish it. So this data is in 2015. It's the most recent data we have available to us. And what you see here is a lot of irrigation water use. So from a diversion basis, and I'll get into the differences here. Actually, why don't I get into the differences first, and then I'll describe the charts. So for most agricultural water uses, if you look at my little diagram here, the river is flowing from the top of the screen to the bottom of the screen. It's the water in this scenario is diverted into a canal. That canal flows along basically a topographic contour by gravity, and then it is diverted onto fields by gravity. The irrigation on those fields, there's tailwater, there's seepage and underflow, and there's drain flow at the tail end of the ditch. There's consumptive use to grow a crop on these fields, meaning the water that doesn't make it back to the river. That's what we call depletion or consumptive use. And then there's a series of return flows from the canal, from the fields, from the tail end of the lateral here. There's a lot of return flows that make it back to the river. So there's basically an amount diverted at the head end. Let's just call that 5 units. There's an amount consumed on the fields. Let's call that 2 units. And so 3 units of what was diverted make their way back to the river at some point along the river here. And those are what we call return flows. That's a very important concept with irrigation and water use. So what these charts represent is
Brett,
the amount of, oh yeah, sure.
Brett, can you go back to that slide with the colored arrows?
Yeah.
I don't see it where I understand your explanation of the consumptive use, in growing the field. I don't see any red arrows indicating that. Am I missing something?
You're not missing the red arrows. I cut this from a broader diagram that I once made, which is why you don't see any red arrows. There's no red arrows. Basically, it's the ET or evapotranspiration of the crop. So in this 2D view, it's the water that is coming towards your face. It's used by the crop in breathing or in ET to grow and to develop yield for that crop. So it's not shown, you're not missing anything. That's what that depletion or consumptive use is it's the water that moves through the stomates of the plant to grow and to breathe.
Thank you. And so essentially you're saying that the example 5 units and then 3 get back to the river. Mm-hmm. The two are the ones that are being consumed during that process. By slowing down the water via canal and laterals and other methods, ultimately 3 out of the 5 end up making their way back to the river anyway, and we're just using 2 of those.
That's right. That's my example.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
And there's other consumptive uses. There might be trees along the canal bank that use a little bit of water. So it's not all used just on the field, but that's the majority of the consumptive use for irrigation diversions. So going to these pie charts, from a diversion basis, irrigation diverts about 87% of all the water diversions in the state of Colorado. The orange part I've identified there is public supply. So this is municipal supplies. Any water provider providing to more than about 15 people is considered a public supply. And you can see they only represent about 8% of the diversions in the state. The two pie charts to the right, one breaks it out by surface water and groundwater. So in the state of Colorado, we're primarily surface water irrigating crops. That's regionally specific. So there are areas where there's more groundwater use, such as the San Luis Valley, and there's areas where there's just all surface water use. And then the bottom right chart is breaking that total amount into diverted and consumed. So the numbers for Colorado, at least in 2015, were we diverted about 10 million acre feet for irrigated agriculture, which is about 3.3 acre feet per acre on average. But the amount that we actually consumed, the amount that actually went towards crop production, is estimated as 3 million acre feet. The other 7 million acre feet returned to the river and made their way down for somebody else to divert downstream. So, using these numbers, which are averaged and broadly across Colorado, we're about 30% of what we divert for irrigated ag is consumed, and 70% returns back and is diverted again for somebody else. So irrigated lands in northern Colorado, this is an interesting map just to look at because I have a couple questions about it. These grayish colored blotches that you see are the irrigated lands from the Department of Water Resources map viewer in 2015. I've highlighted some cities here. So DIA, Fort Collins and Loveland, Boulder, Greeley, Fort Morgan's out here. But these are the irrigated lands in the Northern Front Range. So I have a couple questions. Does anyone have an answer as to why are the irrigated lands located where they're shown? What do you notice about the irrigated lands, at least in terms of where they're located along the Front Range here? Anyone want to hazard a guess?
I'll make a guess. Is it the natural flowing topography that lends itself to gravity feeds in the canal and ditch and lateral system?
You got it. There's two parts to your answer, which I'll break out. The irrigated lands are located along the rivers. That's a simple statement, but it's important to realize that we have this huge area here, where there's no irrigated lands because there's no water. Simple as that. There's no efficient way to get water up in these areas. So we have irrigated lands. As you know, there's a lot of tributary rivers that come off the Front Range Mountains here. The Poudre River, Big Thompson, St. Vrain, Boulder Creek, and the South Platte. I'm just going to trace it right here. If you're seeing my arrow, it curves up here by Greeley and then swings down and heads basically in an eastern direction. So between the tributary rivers coming off the mountains and the main stem South Platte, which snakes here, the irrigated lands are located along river systems. And the point was made, they're basically, the extent of them is through gravity, what's the minimum contour you can run a ditch and still use gravity to get water to those lands? That's kind of the nature of a lot of irrigated lands. Groundwater pumps changed a little bit of that. So we see irrigated lands served by groundwater wells more away from river systems. But in general, that's largely what you see here in northern Colorado because most lands here are surface water irrigated. So second question, why are these cities, which are some of the larger cities in northern Colorado, why are they located where they're located?
Same answer, because of the rivers.
Yeah, same answer, correct. So these cities are here because that's where the good irrigated land was. So back in the 1800s, Greeley established as a colony because the farmland was great. Same thing with Fort Collins and Boulder. You know, located basically as these rivers came off the foothill mountain or the Front Range Mountains, that plain, that delta, where a lot of, you know, geologically speaking, a lot of sediments deposited, creating some very rich, very productive soils. So the combination of good soils and water availability established some of our oldest cities right at that junction. So as these cities grow, you know, there's an inherent conflict there because the old cities established because the lands were productive and the best lands with water supply. So as those cities grow, they're immediately going to, you know, interface with the agricultural lands. And so what we've seen is a loss of irrigated lands from the 1960s to the present. These are a couple of snapshots from some mapping that Open Water Foundation put together a few years ago. But overall, over a 20-year period, USDA census data, they publish their census every 5 years as well. There'll be a 2022 census, ag census at some point to get an updated number. But over a 20-year period there, we saw a 22% decline in irrigated ag lands across the 12 Front Range counties. That's from the Wyoming border down to basically the New Mexico border. 12 Front Range counties saw a 22% decline. And these little images here kind of give you a visual of that. This was Open Water Foundation's mapping of irrigated lands. And you can see pockets where the irrigated lands have reduced, especially in the southwest portion of that image, kind of Thornton, Brighton area. So we've seen a decline in irrigated lands. I'll get into some reasons for that in a couple slides. And just one other point about sort of our water use in Colorado. Our economy of Colorado continues to change and diversify. And so as along with that there's just a continual need in my mind that we will be needing to use water for different things: environmental, recreational, municipal growth, new industries. And so we will need to continue to have ways of moving water between uses and reallocating supplies to meet new demands. So because of the loss of farmland that I showed, and because of the need to move water to new uses, Colorado, as part of their planning effort under what used to be called SWASI, the State Water Supply Initiative, it's now known as the Colorado Water Plan. But as part of that SWASI effort, they looked at the loss of irrigated lands across Colorado. And there was a prediction that about 20% of the total irrigated lands in Colorado would be lost statewide. And it was about 500,000 irrigated acres would be lost. And what I have bullet pointed here in the top left box are the reasons that was estimated. So these are all estimates, but these were the reasons behind that 500,000 acre loss. About 100,000 acres were anticipated to be lost because of urbanization, which is homes being built on the farm. So farmland being developed into homes. In a sense, the water never moves. It's still serving those homes, but in a new use. So that's about 20% of that total. Municipal water transfers, that's when a municipal entity, a utility, acquires water from some other location to bolster its supply to serve its demands. That was estimated to be about 200,000 acres, or 40% of that total. And then other reasons made up about 200,000 acres. These are augmentation needs, compact compliance, that's like Republican River area, CRP enrollments, and groundwater overdraft. So part of this is coming out of the big 2003 legal change in Colorado, where groundwater on a much more it was much more regulated that groundwater wells do impact rivers and have to augment their uses. And as a fallout from that, coming out of 2003, there was predicted to be a lot of groundwater acres either taken out of production or left in production, and they'd have to dry up surface water irrigated acres to provide the augmentation to continue to pump. So there was this prediction of a lot of farmland loss, and there was also a couple other things. There was known to be and some economic problems with the significant dry up in Crowley County in the Arkansas River Basin, as well as some fallowing programs that developed in Southern California, rotational fallowing programs around 2003, 2004, 2005, that were looked on as like innovative and maybe something that Colorado could look to. So as a result, under 2007 legislation, CWCB, the state agency that's behind a lot of water planning efforts in the state, developed a grant program to facilitate the implementation of what they termed ATMs, or alternative transfer methods. So that's when ATMs kind of hit the public view, was around 2007, coming out of that planning effort. And then following several years later in 2015, the Colorado Water Plan at that time created an objective of establishing 50,000 acre feet of ATMs by 2030 in the state. So that's a little history. As part of that grant program that was established in 2007, as of November 2019, there were about $6 million in grants awarded. I don't have an updated number. I was a little late asking for one, so apologies. That number is a little old, but it still gives you a sense of what's been funded here with these grants. Prior to 2015, it was a lot of research efforts across the state, and following after 2015, most of that grant money has been going towards pilot projects to test out ATMs and try to get ATM projects in place. So trying to define ATMs, I have two slides to give you some context on what ATMs are. Just so you're aware, ATMs don't mean anything to anybody outside of Colorado. They're just a term that Colorado created as part of their planning efforts to represent water trading or sharing agreements, permanent dry up of agricultural lands. So keep agricultural lands in production while also creating a water supply. So if you compare that to the status quo, which is in this case a permanent sale, what is largely done development in Colorado is a purchase of that farm to the municipal forever.
Brent,
in
you're coming
perpetuity.
in and out.
And that
I'm
farm
wondering
that
if maybe you camera on you, and if we just could have your screen, that maybe that will help the bandwidth a bit.
Yeah, I'll turn off my camera.
Okay.
Let me know if it keeps up and I'll try something new.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. So the permanent sale example here is sort of what is largely done in Colorado to support new home development. The ATM concept is that you keep the land in production on some schedule or in some fashion. So the farmland doesn't get permanently dried up forever. That's the test or the goal. And then water is transferred to other uses. They could be for municipal use, other uses, on some lease fashion to support the uses of the municipality. So that's the idea around an ATM concept. They are made up of kind of two pieces. This is how I like to think of ATMs, is there is some way that you're generating water that can be transferred off the farm field. And I have listed here several ways that have been used or have been explored, both in Colorado and other states. Various fallowing programs, switching crops, and then you have the method by which you're transferring that water to a new use. And there's various things people have tried in this fashion. So water banks, option contracts, purchases and leasebacks. There's various ways people have tried and tried to construct the deal basically to try to get water to the new use. So an ATM in my mind is a combination of these two things. You're doing something on the farm to generate water to transfer, and then you're implementing some construct or some contract to transfer it. So the purpose of ATMs originally, as I said, I mean, it was driven by this planning exercise that looked at, well, we're going to see potentially 200,000 acres dried up across the state because of municipal transfers. What can we do about it? We don't want to see the permanent dry up of that much acreage. So ATMs kind of got created to solve that problem, which I'm showing here as the red arrows. But as ATMs have been researched, as they've been tried, as state agencies have looked at these types of arrangements, there's sort of a broader context around ATMs, because there are various things you can do to prevent the permanent dry up of irrigated lands, in addition to trying to implement ATMs or water sharing agreements. And ATMs could serve purposes beyond serving new municipal growth and new municipal supply. And I've listed some there. So there's questions at the state level about strictly defining ATMs, on both sides. Do they need to absolutely reduce permanent dry up? And what purposes can they serve? Excuse me. What purposes can they serve beyond just municipal growth? And I was part of a study in 2020 or thereabouts. I think it was published in 2021, maybe, an ATM status update. And if you Google CWCB ATM status report, you'll probably hit it first thing. But this whole discussion of what's the purpose of ATMs and what are some planning items moving forward was a result of that effort. Let me do a time check here, 11:30. Okay, so let's get into some examples.
Brent, can I interrupt you just a minute? We do have a question about water banks, and can you talk a little bit more about water banks, and is that a controversial topic?
Sure. I'll leave it on the slide. So water banks are a term that is used to describe some structure that allows water to be moved to another use more efficiently. It's a very broad definition. People use the term water bank across the Western US to describe different things. But some examples I can give you, in some places there are storage reservoirs, and people hold contract allocations in those reservoirs. And in some places, banks are created that allow people to take their contract allocation in the storage reservoir and lease it to somebody else. And it's done through a water bank. Somebody administers it, pays attention to the accounting, but it allows water to be leased from one contract holder to another use. In other places, water banks are used to describe management of an aquifer, like a valley aquifer, basically. There's pumping in that aquifer here, there, and multiple places. And from a management standpoint, it doesn't really matter if one pump pumps more than another, but everyone has an allocation. And so banks have been set up in groundwater systems to trade allocations. So maybe I don't want to pump my allocation. I want to lease it or sell it to you. And the bank facilitates the tracking of those allocations and allows water to move. So water banks are used, it's a very general term. There is no specific definition of a water bank. In Colorado, the one-time water banking, I think, has been used as a term. There was some legislation passed, and Jennifer, maybe you know, I'm going to say 2005 or 7, and it was focused on the Arkansas, and it was around reservoir storage reallocation, like I was talking about. There's legislation passed that allowed the creation of water banks, but after creating it, the water bank down in the Arkansas never really got utilized. People thought, I think, that the process was a little cumbersome, and they'd rather just do two-party lease agreements. And so that one example in Colorado, at least from a legislated water bank standpoint, never really got utilized.
Thank you, Brett. That was so helpful, because I know that when we've been having some conversations around when we talk about ag space and water in the northern Colorado region, and water banks has come up, and you're right, it means different things to different people. And I was just curious to see what was your association with that, primarily with what you do and water, and then in Colorado, because I also understand that it could also be transferring water rights. So like a farmer has water rights, and they get a great deal, which these are conversations that are happening, where another municipality wants to buy those water rights, and it's lucrative. I mean, it could set that person up, but then that land would be dry, primarily because nobody could do anything on it. And so, what are your thoughts around that? Around, maybe that farmer transferring those water rights to a county level, so government, so to speak, right? But I mean, even there, I see problems with that, because that's perpetuity. Once you transfer your rights, let's just say the county decides, yeah, we're not going to touch those, we're not going to sell those rights to anybody. But once those elected officials or those people change hands, and maybe new people come in, they may decide something different. And so then that land does become dry. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Brett? And I hope I articulated that okay.
Yeah, you hit upon a couple things. I think I'm tracking you. So I have a couple thoughts from what you were talking about. Water banks work well when you have a uniform water, I'll call it a water entitlement or water asset. It's uniform, and so that's why the storage reservoirs I talked about, those contract allocations, they're all the same. Or in the Valley Aquifer, my allocation is the same as your allocation. It's uniform. The problem with banks that are set up to pull in different types of water rights, and what we have in the northern Front Range of Colorado, is a diverse set of water rights. They're all different. That's why water court is so busy. And so in my mind, water banks don't work well when you're bringing in 2 shares of this ditch company and then 3 shares of this other ditch company that's 40 miles away. There's no uniformity of what's coming into the bank, and therefore there's no uniformity for somebody who wants to use that water to say, I would like 3 units, from the bank. There's no uniform unit there, so it doesn't, to me, it's not conducive to a bank, as I think of water banks, because each thing that's put into the bank is unique, has its own legal requirements about return flows, about what consumptive use yield it will have. So I think banks work well from a trading standpoint when you have a uniformity of what's in the bank. And that's very difficult in northern Colorado. Now, second piece of what you're talking about is basically a county banking farmland and associated water rights for conservation purposes. That absolutely is viable, but I would say is partly water-based and it's partly land-based. So Boulder County, you know, embarked on a mission decades ago to conserve a bunch of farmland in Boulder County. And it's conserved. And, you know, they bought it. They didn't put it in a bank, but effectively it's conserved, which sounds like, you know, some of the same maybe motivations as trying to bank farmland.
Thank you. And in your opinion, is that, I mean, it sounds like the challenges may outweigh the benefits.
I think it'd be very difficult to run a water bank with varied different water rights that come into it. If a bank is meant to operate as water comes into the bank and water gets transferred out of the bank. I think that's a difficult, complicated structure to develop. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
It can be done, possibly, but yeah, I think it's very complicated depending on the size of the geography that you're looking at. So what I have showing here is just some reasons that ATMs have either been explored or undertaken, and those reasons vary across the state. So along the Front Range, it's largely municipal. The municipal entities are the ones who want to conduct ATMs to get a supply to support their municipal water systems. In the San Luis Valley, it's largely about groundwater sustainability, so trying different things to keep ag production going in a sustainable manner. On the west slope of Colorado, it's largely environmental or compact compliance. Those are the things driving the research and pilots into ATM agreements. So I have, I think, 4 examples of ATMs that I'll run through. I'll run through them fairly quickly. I probably won't hit all the details here, but these slides, you should have them, or I'm happy to send them so you can read up on these. So I'm gonna probably go through these fairly quickly just so we have time for questions. Out in Sterling, so eastern Colorado, along the South Platte, they entered into an ATM agreement before ATMs were a term. So this agreement was back in 2003, 2004 timeframe. And basically North Sterling Irrigation District entered into an agreement with Xcel Energy. As I was saying, in 2003, there was a big legal change where groundwater pumping needed to augment its uses. And Xcel Energy found themselves needing a source of augmentation supply in dry years, but not all years. And so they partnered or entered into an agreement with North Sterling to say, when we need the water, you will provide water through a lease agreement and reduce your deliveries to your farms, at least those people who participate. And it'll be an interruptible water supply agreement, basically, an option agreement. And that agreement was executed. It's been in place since about 2004, I think. And I think both parties are pretty happy with, you know, how it's gone. Another example is the Catlin Canal pilot project down in the Arkansas. So the Catlin Canal is an irrigation ditch shown there as the red line. The blue line is the Arkansas River. And various farms along that canal enrolled in a pilot project to rotationally fallow, which is the process of say you own 100 acres, you might rotationally fallow saying, I will dry up 30 of my acres each year, but I will rotate which 30. So I'll kind of rotate the fallowing to go along with the cropping cycles. And what that produces is an amount of water every year that can be leased out. But you're not permanently drying up any one piece of ground over that whole period. You're rotating which piece of ground gets dried up and trying to do that in an agriculturally beneficial way. So this is called rotational fallowing, and this was piloted starting around 2015 along the Catlin Canal, down along the Arkansas. And the buyers out of this were several small water districts, municipal water districts along the lower Arkansas up to Colorado Springs. A third example is something Aurora did in 2000, following the 2002 drought. They had a very severe water shortage and were at risk of running out of water supply. So they entered into two short-term projects. One of them continues on. That was phase 2. But basically, they first did a short-term lease with the Highland Canal Company to transfer some of the water out of that canal company. The lands were fallowed to provide that lease. But then following that, what Aurora was able to do is to change the farm production practices to drip irrigation served from groundwater. And those groundwater wells needed to be augmented from a water rights standpoint. But not all of the water rights associated with those lands needed to provide augmentation, generating a water supply that Aurora could transfer for its use. And so under phase 2, what they did here is Aurora invested in irrigation modifications along the Highland Canal and it was able to produce a water supply source for transfer, but kept those lands in production using efficient irrigation techniques and using an alternative water supply source. A similar example to this, slightly different, but similar, is what Colorado Springs Utilities is doing along the Lower Arkansas River with a group called LAMA, the Lower Arkansas Water Management Authority, that provides augmentation water. CSU is investing in changing a bunch of farms from surface to groundwater use. LAMA is going to augment their use, but it does create a transferable supply that CSU can rely on in some years. My final example is a split season lease. This is the concept that shown in the diagram here, where you basically stop irrigation through part of the season. It works well typically with hay or pasture crops, where you're getting maybe multiple cuttings or multiple uses through the summer. But basically, you pick a date, let's say July 1st, and you irrigate the pasture up until that date, July 1st. But then after that date, you don't irrigate it anymore, and the pasture yields go down, but it's still productive for part of the season. And for in-stream flow purposes, this can be a very useful tool because those late summer flows are usually when in-stream flows become critical and maybe in danger of isolating fish or hurting fish species. So these late season flows can be extremely beneficial to the environment and not too impactful to the ag operations. And so Colorado Water Trust helped develop a split season lease agreement on one of the ranches they were involved with on the McKinley Ditch off the Gunnison River system. And basically this little chart here in the lower left kind of shows what they did is they have an agreement where they're allowed to irrigate the pasture up until a certain date, and then once that date comes, then there's no more irrigation, and Colorado Water Trust actually leases the in-stream flows from that point. So I want to get into some barriers. So the long-term costs of leasing water can be expensive. So it's the same mindset of, if you live in a house forever, is it economically advantageous to buy it or to keep paying rent? Beyond just paying, building equity, a lot of numbers would show you that it's beneficial to just buy it as opposed to pay rent indefinitely. And there's a similar concept there with leasing water supplies. It does depend on interest rates and the appreciation in lease rates versus sale prices, but using some reasonable assumptions, it is often advantageous economically to just buy the water and not pay lease prices indefinitely. There's a lot of complicating factors that can adjust that, but it is a there is an economic factor into whether ATMs make sense. There's regulatory barriers to ATMs, so they get scrutinized just like permanent water transfers get scrutinized. You need to basically you need to have the right legal construct to provide ATMs. So for instance, on the West Slope, shepherding water for the Colorado River Basin, protecting water for in-stream flow uses. You need to ensure that you're following Colorado water law when you're trying to accomplish these things. I'm gonna see what else I got here. Yeah. I might let me just talk about this briefly. So sometimes there's a hydrologic barrier. So what I'm showing here are these two white dots are the water treatment plants up near Fort Collins that serve multiple different water utility providers. And these colored ditches shown in the different colors here are the ditches that historically have been the most purchased by those utilities or developers to dedicate to those utilities. And what you see out east here are a lot of farmlands that are in ditch systems that haven't been as transferred, as bought up. And there's kind of an obvious reason why that is any acquisition of water from these ditch systems close into the treatment plants is a whole lot easier to transfer to those treatment plants. Acquiring water down here in the lower area requires perhaps a complicated exchange upstream, perhaps some very expensive infrastructure costs to get it upstream. So sometimes there's just an inherent sort of hydrologic or infrastructure reason why ATMs on these lands lower down the river here would be hard to serve the purpose of municipal use. So that's another barrier. I'm going to skip over that and jump to just really quick some alternatives. So this section is complementary actions. So a question was brought up about conserving farmland. That can be done, and it doesn't involve any water transfers. The example I mentioned earlier is one I show here of Boulder County. Boulder County, bought a lot of farmland and continues to try to, run those lands as farmland under its county conservation open space program. And that can be done, and ATMs can be a complement to that, but it could be done to preserve farmland and address that permanent dry up concern that led to ATMs being created in the first place. Municipal water dedication policies. So dry up of farmland, at least from a municipal standpoint, happens because either the munis need the water supply or home developers are dedicating that water supply. So as we conserve water in the municipal sector, I think paying attention to the amount of water we're asking for per new home has a direct relationship to how much farmland will be dried up to serve those new homes. It gets somewhat complicated, but there is a relationship there. So I think as municipal conservation is successful, we've got to be paying attention to how much water are we asking to developers to bring, because ultimately that relates to how much farmland has to be dried up to serve those new homes. And finally, long-term leasebacks. So people probably have different opinions on this, but what is happening in Colorado and probably will continue to happen to some extent is this scenario where municipal entities acquire a lot of the water rights, and they acquire it for serving those homes and their users in dry years, in droughts. A typical municipal utility will plan in a 1 in 50-year drought, and they'll try to acquire supplies sufficient that they can continue to serve those uses even during those drought years. And that's just good municipal water planning. But what it means is that in most years, average years and wet years, they have a surplus portfolio of water. They don't need all the water that year. And it's become very common practice to lease that water back to agricultural uses across the Front Range. And there's there's a number in the report we did with CWCB, but there's easily 100,000 acre feet or more of annual leasing activity back to agriculture from water rights held by municipalities. And I think that's probably going to continue to occur. And so there's some thought around, well, how can we make that better? That municipals own some of the water rights, but they get leased back on a regular basis. So I flew through the end there fairly quickly. I wanted to leave some time for questions. If you want to jump back to any of those topics I breezed through quickly, I'm happy to do so. But yeah, please ask questions if you have any.
David, go ahead. I know you have a question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm with Hartford Homes, and so obviously we're in many jurisdictions, say Elko on the north side of Fort Collins, we have to acquire water and bring raw shares to Elko in order to develop it all. And like you were just saying, the dedication requirements are at a drought level, which obviously then has this implication for how many farms have to be dried in order to develop new homes in that particular water service district. Are there jurisdictions that are doing creative stuff around taking that non-drought year surplus? As I got introduced to ATMs, be like taking the fat off the top of what's actually needed in an average year and having a deal with a farmer who will fallow in the future in a drought year. Are there jurisdictions that are trying to put that deal together, or is that generally incumbent upon a developer to try to pull off? Because we're very interested in going this direction if we can, but it seems like the scale of executing one is often above what a developer can do.
Yeah, good question, David. I haven't seen a housing development, put a agreement like that together that's been acceptable to a municipality. I think what I have seen is municipalities, look at their portfolio and say, what do we need in terms of a dedication? Can we structure something that's a little more interim? So, but even that, I think the standard is that, exactly as you've experienced, is if you want to build 100 homes, you're going to dedicate sort of the dry year supply to support those 100 homes. And the municipal utility, is going to have some excess water in some years because of that. And it's just, I think that's the standard. And I haven't seen a whole lot of examples of moving away from that.
Yeah, thank you.
Brad, go ahead and put your camera back on.
Oh,
I
forgot it was off.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Anyone else? Question? So Brett, that was fantastic. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Sorry I had to breeze to the end there, but like I said, the slides are available. Take some time to look through them if you want, and please feel free to follow up with other questions if you have them.
Okay, well, thank you, and thanks for the presentation. And it looks like we're heading into lunch right now, where I guess what we'll do is have a 20-minute break for everybody to grab their lunch and eat it. And then we'll be back at 12:20. And then we'll have Emily Hunt talk to us about the Thornton Ag Water Stewardship Program. So enjoy your lunch. Sorry we couldn't have anything delivered to you, but hopefully we'll be in person for the next one. So see you in about 20 minutes. Hey, Benton.
And there were 3.
Yeah, time to get everybody back on.
Hi, Emily.
Emily.
Hi.
Emily, thanks for doing this again.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for the invitation.
It's a great story, I think.
Yeah. Huh. So how's the snow down in the North Denver area?
We have about 5